Welcome to this episode of the podcast series of the Prague University of Economics and Business. My name is Niclas Berggren, and I'm an associate professor of economics at the Faculty of Business Administration at this university, and also researcher at the Research Institute of Industrial Economics in Stockholm. It's my pleasure to have Professor Magnus Henrekson as my guest. Today we will talk about some of the topics that Magnus Henrekson has worked on throughout his career, most of which are of high relevance for Czech society and Czech economics. In a follow-up episode, we will continue this discussion. Magnus Henrekson is one of Sweden's leading academic economists. He's a professor of economics and senior research fellow at the Research Institute of Industrial Economics in Stockholm. He resigned as president of the institute in 2020 after 15 years. Until 2009, he held the Jacob Wallenberg Research Chair in the Department of Economics at the Stockholm School of Economics. After receiving his PhD in 1990 from the University of Gothenburg with his dissertation, An Economic Analysis of Swedish Government Expenditure, he conducted several projects that tried to explain cross-country growth differences. Since the turn of the new millennium, his primary research focus is entrepreneurship economics and the institutional determinants of the business climate. In addition to his academic qualifications, he has extensive experience as an advisor, board member, and lecturer in many different contexts. In June 2023, he became the government's investigator tasked with proposing a new grading system for Swedish schools. He delivered his report in February this year. Magnus Henrekson's works have been cited 18,000 times, according to Google Scholar. He's in Prague this second week of September as a keynote speaker at the conference Institutions, Entrepreneurship and Shared Prosperity, arranged by the World Interdisciplinary Network for Institutional Research, WINEAR, and hosted by the Faculty of Business Administration at the Prague University of Economics and Business. Professor Henrekson, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
I'd like to start with asking you about entrepreneurship. You have worked a great deal, as I said, on entrepreneurship for some decades now. What is entrepreneurship and why it is important in a market economy?
Entrepreneurship is about doing things in a different way, using resources, combining them in new, valuable ways. And not only just combining them, but building companies that can actually produce these new goods and services in ways that are cost efficient and valuable for consumers. Also, that you grow so you can actually reap benefit, the economies of scale, and be able to sell your product at a competitive price.
In your opinion, does economics as a field pay sufficient attention to entrepreneurship theoretically and in practical research?
I would say no, but it's far better now than it used to be. For me personally, as you said, I did research on explaining the growth of government and then explaining economic growth across countries. And then in early 1990s, I read an article by William Baumol called Entrepreneurship, Productive, Unproductive and Destructive. And I guess that changed my life. I realized that this is what I really have to look into. This is what I had to work on, because without entrepreneurs that actually see opportunities and do something with those opportunities that they see, you're not going to get any development. Then you will get, at best, a stagnant economy. But if you get a stagnant economy, that means that you will eventually get a declining economy.
This sounds very important. So what is your explanation for why many economists have not paid very much attention to this phenomenon, entrepreneurship?
Because the entrepreneur is not somebody that you can really capture in a neat, clean mathematical model. It's unpredictable. If entrepreneurship means doing something that others haven't done, and along the way, changing your plans based on experience, based on your failing in one direction, then you change direction, you try to do things in a different way. It's very difficult, or perhaps impossible, to model that in a way that mainstream economics feel is the right way.
From that, I'd like to move on to a related concept, innovation. There's been a lot of talk about innovation in recent years, not least in the European Union. And last year, the Italian economist Mario Draghi published what has been called the Draghi Report, called The Future of European Competitiveness, in which he proposes a comprehensive strategy for the EU to boast economic strength and resilience. And it emphasizes the need for a more integrated and competitive European economy, focusing on innovation, industrial strategy, and a more efficient single market. But worries about too little innovation are also present in the Czech Republic. Every year, the European Commission publishes what it calls the EU Innovation Scoreboard. And last year, the Czech Republic dropped to a 19th place in the European Union. So that means that the country now ranks well below the EU average and has shown little progress over the past 7 years. On the other hand, Nordic countries like Sweden and Denmark continue to lead Europe's innovation landscape. What is innovation and how does it relate to entrepreneurship? Let's begin there.
What people mean by innovation is doing something that's, I would say, more or less radically new, something that hasn't been done before, or doing it in ways that it hasn't been done before, basically in solving some sort of human needs in a different way, something that we demand, but doing it in a different way. So it could be about some sort of medical treatment. Before you had to do open surgery. Now perhaps you don't need to have open surgery, or you can even use a pill or something else that is far less invasive. So you're solving the same problem, but in a much better way. That's innovation. But it's also true that even if a country does not manage to do this kind of radical innovations, it can become very wealthy by imitation, by doing the next step. So you can see that there's an innovation out there, and then your country is very good at building efficient companies that will actually be the ones that conquer the world and produce a lot of value in your society. But if you're not good at innovation, and if you're neither good at building firms and having a good business climate, then of course you're in trouble. And then it's more likely that your industrial sector will be dominated by foreign firms.
So what are the ways to get high innovation in a country? What are the main approaches to answering that question? I'm perhaps thinking here of Mariana Mazzucato, a famous British-Italian economist who argues for a conscious involvement by the government in the economy. So what is your assessment of what works best and what should be avoided if we try to stimulate innovation?
I mean, you need to have very, very strong incentives at the individual level, and a really, really world-class educational system, so that you have lots of young people who are reaching a high analytical skill level, so you can actually do innovation. And then, of course, it's not only that, but you need an entire environment with financiers, with the culture of taking risks, building new companies, but also not being afraid of failure. That's really important. And unfortunately, I guess it's pretty difficult for small countries. It's also true for Sweden, even if we're doing better still. But small countries with their own language, and if they really, really manage to create really, really superstar persons with a fantastic drive and a very, very big innovative skills, it's not unlikely that they will move to that part of the world that is most innovative. That's kind of the best thing for them to do. So it's really a dilemma. But I would say what's important, even if you don't do the first stage of innovative entrepreneurship, you can still be successful in terms of building companies that are valuable. And I mean, that's been the Japanese way after the war, or even before, actually, before World War II, that they imitated, and they were very efficient at building production plants and distributing their products. And for China, of course, it's the same, although people claim now that they are becoming truly innovative even in China.
You mentioned the importance of private incentives. So if we look at the Czech Republic, which is lagging behind in the EU's innovation scoreboard, do you have any concrete suggestions for what a government might do to create those good incentives for people to be innovative in a country? Can the Czech Republic learn anything from Sweden in this regard, which is at the top of this ranking?
Definitely. I'm old enough to remember Sweden in the 1970s and 80s when it was more or less shameful to become wealthy, that people looked suspiciously on persons that created companies that became wealthy. And for this reason, of course, that we had a tax system that penalized that. So if you managed to build a successful firm, then taxation was, I would say, more or less prohibitive. So now we have a tax system that actually, if you build corporate wealth, you get to retain that corporate wealth, and then you reinvest it in new firms looking for new innovative persons, and you help them. You become a financier and a co-owner of those firms, and that's why we have made Stockholm what people sometimes call the startup capital of the European Union. So that's the way I think for the Czech Republic to go. So praise people who manage to build corporate wealth and let them retain their wealth if they reinvest it in new companies and help finding new smart people who build companies, and by doing so also building the wealth and welfare of the Czech Republic.
And what about the EU more generally? You have written a book about this. How could the EU become more innovative? What is wrong in the EU? Why is the United States seemingly much more innovative in most areas than most of Europe nowadays?
If you look back, why did it happen in Europe? Why did Europe become the wealthiest part of the world in the 17th, 18th and 19th century? Some would say it's because of institutional competition. So if you had bad institutional framework for building firms or for economic activity, one German land, another one was more favorable, and then people moved there and started their business there. And that means the other one had to adjust. And in this way, the climate or the framework conditions in Europe became better and better. And now, of course, if you have a European Union that in Brussels, they believe that they can create favorable framework for the entire union, that's unison, that's the same all over, there is a risk that you will create one that is not so favorable. And there is too much thinking of centralized, top-down thinking, saying that we in Brussels know how it should be done, what these conditions should be. And then they tend to overstretch. This is what you see, for instance, in green policies now, that Brussels seem to think that they know that hydrogen is a prime part of the strategy towards net zero. And a lot of money is being poured into that. And now, 5 years later, one after the other of these projects are going bankrupt because they didn't know in Brussels that that was the way forward. So less things should be determined in Brussels and more things should be determined domestically, while, of course, creating a common market for all of Europe. And this is fairly true when it comes to physical goods, but it's not at all true when it comes to services. And this means that if you, as a service provider or innovator in the service industry in Europe, if you create something, then you're very often stuck to your own fairly small domestic market. Whereas in the United States, that's not true. They have this enormous market that's larger than the entire European Union market. And then eventually we will have to let them in. So then US firms will be dominant. So you have companies like Booking.com, Hotels.com, Airbnb, etc. You can't keep them out. And then what happens? Hotels.com, they very often, that's how we book our hotel rooms, and they will charge 18% of what you're paying for your hotel. 18% will go to a US company, and then the money will probably end up in some sort of tax haven somewhere. So it's like they taxing the hotel market in Europe by 18% instead of us having from the start developed something similar before.
Concretely, could I ask about AI and this new technology? If you look at the companies working on that and also with the physical products related to that, they're basically all in the US. Why is that, do you think? Is Europe not open to that kind of technology? Are we too regulated when it comes to digital markets? Or do you have any idea what explains that very big difference in development of that sector?
Well, all the know-how, of course, is gathered in particular places in the United States. That's one important reason. So they have this critical mass of persons. And then also there is a different culture. People have become really wealthy in the United States. The culture is use your money to build the future. Your money is for them a means of achieving something new in the next step, whereas people who become really wealthy in Europe don't seem to have that mindset. Then you feel that how can I protect my wealth? Whereas in the US, it's a means by achieving more and more and more. So for wealthy people in the United States, money is a medium of change to a much greater extent. And that's really important.
I now want to move on to a slightly different topic. In recent years, you have done important work on what you call institutional entrepreneurship. What do you mean by this term, and why did you start working on that?
Well, institutional entrepreneurship means that in most cases, economic interest can lobby for a change of institutions, either for the better or for the worse. We have one example of how they did it for the better, and that was the US film industry that started out in New York and was monopolized, and Thomas Edison was the one who had ideas that it should be monopolized in a way that he and his companies would make all the money. They moved over to Los Angeles and created institutions for the industry that benefited the industry as a whole, and all of it went over there. And then they created voluntary censorship rules so that they avoided being censored by government in the 1930s when there were demands for censorship. So they created their own system and avoided having much more strict rules imposed by the government. So that's one way. The other way, of course, is that you create institutions that would lobby for a change in institutions that favors already incumbent interests. And then it becomes really bad. So you lobby for changes so that your industry will benefit. And we see that now in energy. So if we really want to be net zero, we need electricity at affordable prices, but electricity that's base load, that means that planned electricity. And of course, nuclear power and hydropower are ideal. But already in the 1970s, the oil companies in the United States started lobbying hard against nuclear energy. And then the green movement took over. And now we're stuck with solar energy and wind energy to an extent that's creating a lot of problems. And electricity is now so expensive in Europe that it's a threat to our industrial future.
We will get back to the question of energy in our second episode. But to continue with the institutional entrepreneurship, in many countries it seems like economic development is stymied by rent-seeking, interest groups, as you mentioned, and even corruption. Basically, various relations where the economic sector tries to influence the political sector to benefit them, maybe by restricting competition. And I think many people have observed it also in post-communist countries, that many people who became rich after the planned economy became privatized. This happened through a lot of political connections in some countries. How big a problem do you think this is in Europe today, and how can you avoid this problem so that entrepreneurship talents are channeled into more productive enterprises than trying to lobby the government for favors?
Yeah, so having an open market with open competition for everyone and rule of law, etc., this is an anomaly. We are not, I would say, biologically built for those kind of systems. So it's very difficult to understand intuitively that it does work, and actually that it's the only system that creates general social welfare for virtually everybody. So the normal way is to build on kinship, on personal ties, and even on corruption, in the sense that I have something that you want, so I want some extra money on the side, or my son-in-law is a judge over there, so therefore I will judge differently if I commit a crime than somebody else. So when we open up in Eastern Europe, and the way it was done, of course, those who had the upper hand managed to usurp very large resources in one sweep. And of course, it was wrong and created a lot of resentment. So That's how it became. And then, of course, when they became so wealthy, it's not so surprising that they also vied for getting political power also in order to retain the resources that they had usurped. They realized that if they didn't get that kind of political power, in the end, their wealth would not appear to be legitimate, and there would be demands that it should be confiscated to some extent. So it's very, very difficult to make the transition. And the countries that were industrialized and reasonably democratic before the Second World War have done much better than those that were not.
With those words, we finished the first episode of the interview with Magnus Henrekson. Thanks a lot for being on this podcast. To you who listen, I hope you will continue to the second part, covering important topics like the challenge of economic growth, the green transformation, how to ensure a good education system, and more.